The San Antonio River is so narrow that in most places you can throw a stone across it. It has no commercial traffic. You cannot ship freight on it. It connects to no great lake, no major bay, no ocean port worth mentioning. And from that trickle of water rose the seventh largest city in the United States, 1.43 million people, a metropolitan area pushing 3 million, a place that has been continuously inhabited longer than Boston, longer than Philadelphia. The San Antonio River is a footnote by every measure of what's supposed to make a river important. But everything that happened in this city, every war, every fortune, every catastrophe, happened because of it. And the strangest chapter came in 1928, when a group of San Antonio's most powerful businessmen looked at the winding downtown stretch of their founding river and proposed filling it with concrete. They wanted to pave it into a storm sewer and build a road on top. That proposal, to bury the thing that made the city possible, is where this story has to begin. Because to understand why they wanted to kill the river, you have to understand what the river had already done and what it had already cost. The Payaya people, who lived along its banks for centuries before any European arrived, called the river Yanaguana. The word meant something like refreshing waters, and it was precise. The San Antonio River is spring-fed, drawing from the Edwards Aquifer deep underground, and unlike the muddy, unpredictable waterways elsewhere in Texas, it ran clear and cool even through scorching summers. When a Spanish expedition under Domingo Terán de los Rios camped beside it on June 13, 1691, the feast day of St. Anthony of Padua, they named the river and moved on. But they remembered it. The springs, the shade, the fertile soil along the banks. In a landscape that could be brutally arid, this valley was an anomaly. 27 years later, in 1718, a Franciscan friar named Antonio de Olivares, who had been petitioning the Viceroy of New Spain for years, finally got his permission. On May 1st, Father Olivares performed the rites establishing Misión San Antonio de Valero on the west bank of the river. Governor Martín de Alarcón founded the accompanying presidio and villa days later. The expedition that planted this settlement totaled 72 people, 35 soldiers, their families, a handful of friars, a few civilians. That was it. 72 people at the farthest edge of a failing empire, surrounded by hundreds of miles of empty frontier, building in limestone and adobe beside a stream you could wade across. Within 13 years, they built 5 missions along the river: Valero, San Jose, Concepcion, San Juan, Espada, strung like beads on a chain running 8 miles through the valley. In 1731, a group of 56 settlers from the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa arrived after a sea voyage to Cuba and an overland march of more than 1,100 miles through Mexico. They were the first official civilian colonists, dispatched by King Philip V to populate this frontier settlement. On July 19th, the presidio captain read them a decree from the Viceroy declaring them and their descendants hijos dalgo, persons of nobility. They laid out their villa, chose the site for San Fernando Church, held the first election in Texas on August 1st, and began farming the river bottomlands. Descendants of those Canary Islander families still live in San Antonio today. But the missions needed water, and the river alone wasn't enough for what they intended. So the Spanish did something that still shapes San Antonio today. They dug acequias. These were gravity-fed irrigation canals, a technology the Spanish had inherited from the Moors, who had inherited it from even older civilizations in the arid Middle East. Beginning around 1719, conscript Indian labor carved more than 50 miles of ditches through the limestone and clay, diverting water from the river and from San Pedro Springs to the mission fields and the villa's farmland. 7 major acequias eventually laced the settlement. The Espada Aqueduct, a stone structure built to carry water across a creek bed, is still in working use. the only Spanish colonial aqueduct still functioning in the United States. What the acequias meant economically was that San Antonio could farm in a place that shouldn't have supported farming. Corn, beans, peppers, sugarcane, melons. The missions ran cattle herds and sheep flocks. By the 1740s, Mission San Jose alone was running nearly 1,500 head of cattle across its ranch lands. The entire practice of open-range ranching, the skills, the terminology, the culture of moving cattle across long distances that would later define the American West, was developed first in Mexico and refined in these San Antonio mission fields. Before there were cowboys in Kansas, there were vaqueros along the San Antonio River. But Spain was losing interest. By the end of the 18th century, the empire had stretched itself too thin. Funding dried up. The missions were secularized, their lands parceled out, their Indian populations dispersed or absorbed. San Antonio shrunk to a remote frontier village under Spanish, then Mexican rule. The population hovered around 2,000. The old Mission Valero, abandoned as a religious institution, became a military barracks. Soldiers stationed there in the early 1800s gave it a new name, likely after a company of Mexican soldiers from the town of Alamo de Parras. They called it the Alamo. In February 1836, roughly 200 Texian and Tejano defenders, the exact number is still debated, occupied the old mission compound as General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna marched north with an army of several thousand to crush the Texas Rebellion. The co-commanders were William Barrett Travis, a 26-year-old cavalry officer who'd arrived under protest, and James Bowie, the knife-fighting adventurer ravaged by illness. David Crockett, former Tennessee congressman and the most famous frontiersman in America, had wandered in with a group of volunteers a few weeks earlier. On February 23rd, Santa Anna's advance guard entered San Antonio and raised a blood-red flag from the bell tower of San Fernando Church, the same church the Canary Islanders had laid the cornerstone for in 1738, just 7 years after marching 1,100 miles from the coast to populate this settlement. The red flag meant no quarter. Travis answered with a blast from the fort's 18-pounder cannon. The siege lasted 13 days. On the morning of March 6th, roughly 1,800 Mexican assault troops advanced in the pre-dawn darkness. Travis fell early at the north wall. Bowie was killed in his sickbed. Crockett's death has been argued over for nearly 2 centuries. He may have fallen fighting at the west wall, or he may have been captured and executed. Nearly all the defenders died. Santa Anna ordered the bodies burned. It was supposed to be a warning. Instead, it became a rallying cry. 6 weeks later, Sam Houston's army routed Santa Anna at San Jacinto, screaming, "Remember the Alamo," and the Republic of Texas was born. San Antonio was devastated. The city that had been the foremost settlement in Texas, the capital of the province for a century, was wrecked by war. When the Mexican-American War ended in 1848 and Texas was fully absorbed into the United States, San Antonio's population had dropped to perhaps 800 people. 800. In a place that had once been the anchor of an empire's northern frontier. And here is where the impossible rise begins. Because San Antonio came back, not once, but repeatedly, from situations that would have killed most cities permanently. German immigrants flooded in during the 1840s and 1850s, drawn by impresario grants and cheap land. By 1860, German speakers actually outnumbered both Tejanos and Anglos in the city, and the population had climbed to over 8,000, making San Antonio, briefly, the largest town in Texas. They built the King William neighborhood south of downtown along the river, lined it with elegant Victorian and Italianate homes, and named it after Kaiser Wilhelm of Prussia. They opened breweries. William Menger, who'd arrived from Germany in the 1840s, started brewing beer on the old Alamo battleground in 1855, and then built a hotel next door. The Menger Hotel opened on February 1st, 1859, a 2-story, 50-room cut limestone building designed by architect John M. Fries and built by contractor J. H. Campman. It was immediately successful. Cattlemen closed deals in the lobby. The U.S. Army, which had established a garrison in San Antonio in 1845 and was using the Alamo itself as a quartermaster depot, sent its officers to dine in the colonial room on wild game and snapper soup made from turtles pulled out of the San Antonio River. The Civil War barely touched San Antonio physically, though it served as a Confederate supply depot, and its cotton traders made fortunes running goods through Mexico to dodge the Union blockade. It was what came after that transformed the city. The cattle industry exploded. San Antonio became the southern anchor of the trail drives, the starting point of the Chisholm Trail, where herds were assembled, drovers hired, and supplies purchased before the long push north to the Kansas railheads. Cattlemen and cowboys poured money into the town. An important wool market developed alongside the cattle trade as ranchers imported merino sheep to the adjacent hill country. By the 1870s, San Antonio was the undisputed commercial hub of the Southwest, a frontier boom town where cattle barons, Army officers, German merchants, and Mexican laborers jostled on the same streets. But there was a problem that was holding San Antonio back from becoming what Houston and Galveston already were. It had no railroad. In the 1850s, the entire American economy was reorganizing itself around rail, and San Antonio, sitting in south-central Texas, 200 miles from the coast, with no navigable river, was simply unreachable by modern transportation. It was, economically, a frontier town running on hooves and wagon wheels. On February 19, 1877, the first passenger train of the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railway steamed into the city. The boom that followed was immediate and enormous. A second railroad, the International Great Northern, arrived from the Northeast in 1881. By 1900, 5 separate railroads served San Antonio, and the population had surged to over 53,000. The Menger Hotel, flush with guests who could now actually reach the city, installed an extraordinary bar in 1887. Solid cherry wood, cherry-paneled ceiling, French mirrors, gold-plated spittoons, a replica of the tap room in the House of Lords Club in London. The beer was chilled by the Alamo Madre Acequia, which still ran through the hotel courtyard. Mint juleps came in solid silver tumblers. Theodore Roosevelt first visited the Menger in 1892 on a javelina hunting trip. He came back in 1898 when the Spanish-American War broke out and recruited his Rough Riders, the first United States volunteer cavalry, right there at the bar. Choosing San Antonio because it was already crawling with the kind of men he wanted: hard-riding frontiersmen, former cavalrymen, and cowboys who could shoot from the saddle. He returned in 1905 for a banquet. The Menger's guest book over the decades would include Sam Houston, Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, Presidents McKinley, Taft, and Eisenhower, and the poet Sidney Lanier, who spent the winter of 1872 to 73 living at the hotel while writing about San Antonio's peculiar beauty. The military, meanwhile, had been quietly becoming the other engine of San Antonio's economy. The U.S. Army had maintained a continuous presence since 1845. In the 1870s, Major General Edward Ord supervised construction of a supply depot on Government Hill that became the nucleus of Fort Sam Houston. By 1890, the post, named after the hero of San Jacinto and first president of the Republic of Texas, was one of the largest Army installations in the country. Then, in 1910, something happened at Fort Sam Houston that had nothing to do with the frontier or the Mexican border. Lieutenant Benjamin Foulois brought the United States Army's only airplane to the post and, on March 2nd, made his first solo flight. He had essentially been ordered to learn to fly by himself. His primary instructors were the Wright brothers, who coached him through the mail. Those early planes were dangerous enough that the first American military aviator to die in a crash, Lieutenant George E. Kelly, was killed at Fort Sam Houston the following year. Kelly Field, named in his honor, opened in 1917 for flight training and became the oldest continuously operating flying base in the Air Force. Brooks Field followed the same year for flight training and aerospace medicine. Randolph Field, nicknamed the West Point of the Air, opened in 1931. Lackland came in 1941, carved off from Kelly. San Antonio became Military City, USA, a title it still holds, and the economic impact was staggering. The military facilities even attracted Hollywood. The 1927 film Wings, shot partly at Kelly Field and Camp Stanley, won Best Picture at the first ever Academy Awards. During World War II, more than 1,000 recruits passed through Fort Sam Houston every single day. After the war, over 500,000 soldiers used the post to transition back to civilian life. But I've been circling around the event that changed everything, and I need to go back to the river. On the evening of September 9, 1921, the remnants of a hurricane that had come ashore near Tampico, Mexico, stalled over central Texas. The storm dropped over 7 inches of rain on San Antonio in roughly 24 hours, with as much as 14 inches falling on the Olmos Creek watershed north of downtown. All of that water funneled south through the San Antonio River and its tributaries. By 10 o'clock that night, St. Mary's Street, a main north-south thoroughfare, had become a river itself. The water kept rising. In the downtown business district, basements filled first, then first floors. At the corner of St. Mary's and Commerce, the water reached 10 feet deep. 14 of the 27 downtown bridges were destroyed. Streetcar rails twisted off their beds and lay scattered on the sidewalks like thrown wire. The morning light revealed total devastation. City streets were choked with debris, overturned automobiles, shattered lumber, mud. On the west side, where the city's poorest residents, overwhelmingly Mexican and Mexican-American families, lived in dense clusters of jacales and shanties along the banks of Alazan and San Pedro creeks, the surge had come without warning. It was midnight when the water rose. Most people were asleep. Desperate cries for help were heard through the darkness along the creeks, but there was no organized rescue and no warning system. The official death toll was 51, but historians have argued the real number may have been as high as 250, because many of the poorest victims were never reported. Property damage was estimated at $5 million, roughly $75 million in today's money. The city responded with engineering. A Boston firm, Metcalf and Eddy, had actually warned the previous year that a catastrophic flood was statistically overdue. Now the money materialized. The Almost Dam, 1,900 feet wide and 60 feet high, was completed in late 1926 at a cost of $1.6 million. A downtown bypass channel was cut to divert floodwaters around the horseshoe-shaped Great Bend of the river, the most vulnerable stretch and the heart of the original Spanish settlement. Floodgates at both ends of the bend would seal it off during high water. And then came the proposal that almost erased everything. In 1928, with the bypass channel nearly finished and the Great Bend now separated from the main flow, several prominent businessmen argued the logical next step: drain the bend, fill it with concrete, pave it over, and use the surface for a road or parking. The river in downtown was, they argued, nothing but a hazard and a nuisance. It smelled, it flooded, it attracted crime. It was, by the cold logic of real estate, wasted space. They were not wrong about any of those things. And if they had succeeded, there would be no riverwalk, no tourism industry, no 15-mile urban park that today generates billions of dollars annually. San Antonio would be a different city, almost certainly a smaller, less distinctive one. What stopped them was a 27-year-old architect named Robert H. Hugman, who had just returned to San Antonio from 3 years in New Orleans. Hugman had watched the Vieux Carré Commission work to preserve the French Quarter's architectural heritage, and he believed San Antonio could do something analogous with its Spanish colonial past, specifically with its river. On June 28, 1929, Hugman stood before Mayor Chambers, 2 city commissioners, property owners, and civic leaders and presented a plan he called the Shops of Aragon and Romula. Instead of paving over the Great Bend, Hugman proposed installing floodgates, building a small dam, lining the banks with limestone walkways, planting trees and gardens, and filling the street-level storefronts with shops, restaurants, and cafes. He told the room that San Antonio had doubled its population in the past decade and was transforming from a sleepy southern town to a future metropolis. Then he asked them to consider the commercial possibilities. There is a particular kind of courage involved in telling powerful businessmen that the thing they want to destroy is actually the thing that will make them rich. Hugman had it. But timing did not cooperate. The stock market crashed 4 months after his presentation. The Depression killed every private funding source. Hugman spent the next 7 years keeping his plan alive through drawings, speeches, and private meetings, all while picking up whatever public works commissions he could find, redesigning parks, building walkways along creeks in smaller Texas towns. He was essentially an architect without clients, sustained by a single obsession. In 1936, 2 things happened that cracked the door open. The 3rd annual Fiesta River Parade drew unexpectedly large crowds, convincing Jack White, the manager of the White Plaza Hotel, which sat at the end of the Great Bend, that there was still public enthusiasm for the river. White organized riverside property owners into a San Antonio River Beautification Committee, hired Hugman, and raised a $400,000 budget. Congressman Maury Maverick secured federal WPA funding. In the summer of 1938, Hugman became the project's official architect. Ground was broken on March 29, 1939. Over 1,000 WPA workers began the transformation, excavating and widening the channel, lining the banks with limestone blocks that Hugman insisted be laid in slightly irregular curves to mimic a natural stream, building 31 stairways from the street level down to the river, planting nearly 12,000 trees and shrubs. Hugman designed every detail: the stone bridges, the iron railings, the outdoor theater where the audience sat on one side of the river and the stage stood on the other, the only theater of its kind in the world. He named it for the project's supervising engineer, Edward P. Arneson, who died in 1939 before it was finished. But Hugman's insistence on limestone stonework, the very element that would come to define the Riverwalk's character, infuriated his critics. Even Atlee B. Ayres, the city's most distinguished architect, complained that the project was not being done in a simple manner. The San Antonio Conservation Society, whose members had helped save the river from being paved over, turned against Hugman's ornamental approach. In March 1940, Mayor Maury Maverick quietly redirected a shipment of stone meant for the Riverwalk to his own adjacent La Villita restoration project. Hugman filed a formal complaint. The Oversight Committee, tired of the controversies, unanimously fired him. He had designed the most important piece of urban infrastructure in San Antonio's history. They fired him for caring too much about the stone. Most of Hugman's elements were already in place when landscape architect J. Fred Buens was hired to finish the job. In March 1941, the WPA signed over to the city 8,500 feet of improved riverbanks. The Riverwalk was dedicated the following month with the first Fiesta River Parade. The total cost, $355,000 in federal WPA funds plus local contributions, would, adjusted for inflation, barely cover a single luxury hotel suite today. And then, almost nothing happened. For 20 years, the Riverwalk sat there. One restaurant, Casa Rio, the first in the river bend, opened in the early 1940s. A few tourists wandered down the stone stairways, but the area was still widely perceived as dangerous and seedy. The military declared parts of it off-limits to personnel. People who'd warned Hugman that he'd be drowned like a rat in your own hole — he had opened an architectural office in a basement at river level — felt vindicated. The Riverwalk was, by most commercial measures, a failure. Meanwhile, a block away from the river, something had happened in 1936 that nobody noticed at the time, but that perfectly captures San Antonio's strange habit of being the place where American culture quietly changes direction. In November of that year, a record producer named Don Law, working for the American Recording Company, set up a portable studio in room 414 of the Gunter Hotel on Houston Street. The Gunter had opened in 1909, a block from the river in the thick of downtown, and Law was using it as a base to record regional musicians, country acts, gospel groups, Tejano artists. On November 23rd, a 25-year-old blues guitarist from Mississippi named Robert Johnson sat down in the parlor of room 414, turned his face to the wall because he was too shy to face the other musicians, and recorded 8 songs. Among them were Sweet Home Chicago, I Believe I'll Dust My Broom, and Terraplane Blues. He came back a few days later and cut Crossroad Blues. Johnson died 2 years later at 27, probably poisoned, and his record sold modestly. It would be decades before the world understood that the template for rock and roll had been laid down in a hotel room in San Antonio by a man so nervous he played facing the corner. The Gunter Hotel is still there. Bar 414, the hotel's speakeasy lounge, is named for the room. Some of the cocktails are named after Johnson's songs. Through the 1950s, San Antonio's leadership struggled with what to do about the languishing Riverwalk. In a moment of desperation, the Chamber of Commerce hired the design firm that had built Disneyland to propose a revitalization plan. When the Marco Engineering Company delivered its concept in 1961, it looked like a theme park, and it horrified local architects. David J. Strauss, the appliance wholesaler who'd pushed for the study, was appalled by what he'd commissioned. The Disneyland plan was shelved. What saved the Riverwalk was not a plan, but an event. In 1959, a local businessman named Jerome K. Harris began pitching an idea for a World's Fair to celebrate San Antonio's multicultural heritage and its ties to Latin America. He called it HemisFair. The concept gained traction through the early 1960s. Construction magnate Henry B. Zachary signed on as chairman. Congressman Henry B. Gonzalez secured federal support. The Bureau of International Expositions in Paris granted official status in 1965. The city acquired a 92-acre site on the southeastern edge of downtown through eminent domain, demolishing 1,349 structures, an old neighborhood called Germantown, home to German, Mexican, Polish, and African-American families, to clear the ground. The announced cost was $156 million. The cost of clearing the site was human as well as financial. Generations of families were displaced from a neighborhood that had housed immigrants and working-class residents since the 19th century. Only 24 of the 129 historic structures the Conservation Society recommended saving were preserved. HemisFair 68 opened on April 6, 1968, 2 days after the assassination of Martin Luther King, Jr. Lady Bird Johnson and Governor John Connally attended under heavy security, both having received death threats. 30 nations built pavilions. Corporate exhibitors included Ford, General Electric, IBM, and Coca-Cola. A monorail linked the grounds. More than 6.3 million visitors came over the 6-month run. The fair lost $7.5 million. Mayor Walter McAllister had pledged it wouldn't cost San Antonio taxpayers a thin dime. But HemisFair did 2 things that money couldn't buy. First, it gave San Antonio the Tower of the Americas, a 750-foot observation tower designed by local architect O'Neill Ford, whose 1.4 million-pound top house was built at ground level and then hoisted to the top of the concrete shaft over 20 days using 24 steel lifting rods. The city had approved $5.2 million in bonds for it, and clearing of the site began within hours of the financial documents being signed. The tower became the tallest observation structure in the United States and remained so for 28 years. Second, and far more importantly, HemisFair extended the Riverwalk into the fair site, and for the first time, an international audience saw what Hugman had built. Hotels began rising along the river. Restaurants opened on the stone pathways. The thing that had been ignored for a quarter century was suddenly, obviously, irreplaceable. Robert Hugman lived to see it. In 1978, 2 years before his death, the city honored him in a ceremony at the Arneson River Theater he had designed 4 decades earlier. He struck one of the new bells being hung near the stage. One bell bore an inscription dedicated to him. The architect who had been fired for using too much limestone, whose career never fully recovered, who spent 15 years working as a staff architect at Randolph Air Force Base, stood on the banks of the river he had saved and heard the city finally say his name. What followed was an economic transformation that no one in 1941 or even in 1968 could have predicted. The Riverwalk became the commercial spine of downtown San Antonio and one of the most visited urban parks in the United States. Since 1962, 8 major hotels have been built directly on the Riverwalk. The Hilton Palacio del Rio went up in 1968 specifically for HemisFair, constructed using a modular method that stacked prefabricated rooms like blocks. The entire 496-room hotel was finished in 202 days. The River Center Mall opened in 1988 on an extension of the river, anchored by a Marriott hotel. More than 50 restaurants eventually lined the walkways. In 2009, the city completed a $72 million Museum Reach extension, stretching the Riverwalk north to the Pearl District. A Mission Reach extension pushed it south past the 4 southern missions, creating a continuous 15-mile linear park. The San Antonio tourism industry, of which the Riverwalk is the undisputed centerpiece, today generates an estimated $15 billion annually and supports tens of thousands of jobs. A $355,000 WPA project became a multi-billion-dollar economic engine. The return on investment is so large, it's almost embarrassing to calculate. But the Riverwalk alone doesn't explain how San Antonio became the 7th largest city in the country. And any honest accounting has to grapple with the other forces. The military has been the steadiest. Joint Base San Antonio, which consolidated Fort Sam Houston, Lackland Air Force Base, and Randolph Air Force Base in 2010, is one of the largest military complexes in the Department of Defense. Fort Sam Houston hosts the Army's Medical Training Command. By 2011, it was the largest military medical training facility in the world, with more than 25,000 students cycling through annually. Lackland handles all Air Force basic training. The military payroll and the civilian jobs it supports have been the economic bedrock of San Antonio for over a century, providing the kind of stable, middle-class employment that many Sunbelt cities never had. And then there is the cultural identity. Harder to quantify, but perhaps the truest explanation. Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who designed Central Park, passed through San Antonio in the 1850s and described it as having a jumble of races, costumes, languages, and buildings that only New Orleans could rival. He called it one of the only places in the United States with odd and antiquated foreignness. That was before the railroads, before the military, before tourism. What Olmsted saw was something structural. San Antonio was and is the place where Spanish, Mexican, German, and Anglo-Southern cultures genuinely mixed, rather than merely coexisting. The Canary Islanders established the first civil government. The missions blended Catholic and indigenous architectural motifs. German brewers built their mansions along the same river where acequia water had irrigated Spanish colonial farms. The chili queens, Mexican women who served chili con carne, tamales, and enchiladas from open-air stands on Alamo Plaza and in Market Square nightly from the late 19th century into the 20th, fed cowboys, soldiers, tourists, and writers. Stephen Crane ate there. O. Henry ate there and wrote about it. In 2017, UNESCO designated San Antonio a city of gastronomy, the first city in the United States to receive that honor. And it was rooted in a culinary tradition that stretched back to those nighttime chili stands. San Antonio's population tells the story in numbers. In 1850, 3,488. In 1860, 8,235, the largest town in Texas. After the devastation of war, it rebuilt. By 1880, with the railroad, 20,550. By 1900, 53,321, again the largest city in the state. By 1920, 161,379, still the largest. In 1930, 231,542. By 1950, 408,442. San Antonio eventually lost the population crown to Houston and Dallas, cities with oil money and deeper industrial bases, but it never stopped growing. The 2020 census counted 1.43 million people within the city limits. The metropolitan area holds nearly 2.8 million. No oil boom fueled this. No steel mills, no auto plants, no tech bubble. San Antonio grew on water, soldiers, cattle, tourists, and the sheer accumulated weight of being the oldest major settlement in the region, the place everyone passed through because it had always been the place everyone passed through. The Pearl Brewery, founded in 1883 and for more than a century one of the largest in the state, shut down operations in 2001. Its smokestacks had been as recognizable as the Alamo in the San Antonio skyline. A development firm called Silver Ventures bought the 23-acre site and turned it into a mixed-use district, restaurants, boutiques, a campus of the Culinary Institute of America. The old 1894 brew house became Hotel Emma, a luxury boutique hotel with original copper kettles preserved as decor. It is, in miniature, the story of the entire city. Something that should have been demolished was instead reimagined, and it became more valuable in its second life than it ever was in its first. The Menger Hotel is still open, directly on Alamo Plaza, 316 rooms, the oldest continuously operating hotel west of the Mississippi. The Cherrywood Bar, where Roosevelt recruited his Rough Riders, is still there, though the beer is no longer chilled by an acequia. The Alamo itself, which has been a mission, a fortress, a military barracks, and very nearly a hotel, still stands in the middle of downtown, the most visited historic site in Texas. The Spanish governor's palace, completed in 1749 on Military Plaza, is open for tours. The 5 missions along the river received UNESCO World Heritage status in 2015, the first site in Texas to be so designated, joining the Taj Mahal and the Great Pyramids on the list. The Espada Aqueduct still carries water. In the early hours of the morning, before the tourist boats start running and the restaurant workers set out their sidewalk tables, you can walk down one of Hugman's 31 stone stairways and stand at the river level of the Great Bend. The limestone walls curve in the slightly irregular lines he insisted on. Bald cypress trees, planted during the WPA project, lean out over the water. The river is very quiet and very small. It is the same water that drew the Payaya, that the Spanish missionaries diverted through 50 miles of hand-dug ditches, that flooded St. Mary's Street to a depth of 10 feet in 1921, that a group of businessmen tried to bury under concrete. The same water that a young architect staked his career on saving and lost his job for it, and was vindicated too late to matter much to him personally. San Antonio was never supposed to work. It had no harbor, no navigable river, no railroad for the first century and a half of its existence, no oil, no heavy industry. It was founded by 72 people at the outermost edge of an empire that was already collapsing. Its most famous battle was a massacre. Its worst flood killed people in their sleep. Its greatest architect was fired. Its World's Fair lost money. and it is the 7th largest city in the United States. The river still runs through the middle of it, clear and spring-fed, and so narrow you could throw a stone across.